Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 55. I am the show's host, Kyle. Very happy to be here today working on getting some new intro music for the show. I think that's been something that a few of my listeners have requested, so I hope to get that soon. If you do like the show, please share the show. It will help the show to grow and get the news out to more people, and so we're just going to jump right into it today. The first story I want to talk about are some things to do with Donald Trump. First, he said that the deal that Obama made with Cuba was a bad deal for Americans, and he's going to walk back some of the parts of what Obama agreed to do with Cuba in an attempt to normalize relations between the two countries. That I haven't seen any clear guidelines on what Trump is planning to do. It looks like it'll be some restrictions, not a full pullback from what Obama did. Of course, this is a move in the wrong direction. While I rarely commend Obama for anything that he did, the Cuba deal along with the Iran nuclear deal are two things that definitely were moves in the right direction. It's always good to be normalizing relations with countries rather than destabilizing relations with countries. Of course, Cuba feels kind of upset. I think they saw themselves as agreeing with the Obama administration to this deal, and kind of there being some good faith built between the two countries that has now been turned back because Trump is walking back on the deal. Of course, I think this will be probably the most effective thing that Americans could do if they want to make Cuba a more humanitarian and better place, would be to trade more with Cuba. The more U.S. tourists you have going to Cuban resorts and talking with the Cuban people, the more the Cuban people will be exposed to the ideals of America, and I think they're pretty superior to some of the ideals in Cuba. If you look at the place, it's not exactly one of the best countries in the world to live. And so the U.S. is kind of stated an own goal in Cuba for the past few decades has really been to get rid of the Castro regime, not only because of some of the transgressions that the Americans have with Castro, but because of his poor human rights record. And of course, the Castro regime is still in charge, however, no longer the brother. And so this is, and so the policy that the United States has had to isolate Cuba in an attempt to keep Cuba in the cold from the rest of the world until they agreed to come and shake hands with and bow knee to the United States is being walked back on by Donald Trump, unfortunately. And that the policy that the United States has had by isolating them has absolutely failed. And so Obama's idea to kind of bring them in and to see if that would have any benefits certainly would have. However, unfortunately, Trump's walking back on it. Another policy of Trump's we get to is that parents of citizens will no longer be able to stay in the country. This was a policy that Obama had put in place, however, it was not implemented. This is more of an immigration policy. However, I'd just like to note these because I think a lot of times they do have, to some extent, to do with the U.S. foreign policy, whether it's people coming from Middle Eastern countries where the country has been destabilized by U.S. policy, or Central and South American countries where the U.S. has destabilized the region with our drug policies and drug habits, are definitely things that, so we see refugees from those wars pouring into the United States at times, and that's why I bring those up on the show. In other news, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and close advisor, is headed to the Middle East in an attempt to resolve this problem with Egypt, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and a few other Arab states. I don't know how much Qatar is going to want to negotiate with these other countries, that they're going to kind of say, well, you put us out on an island, so, screw you guys, we're going to stick with the Iranians and the Turks, or how this is going to go. Some of the fallout of this policy has been, I guess, a lot of the weapons that were flowing to the Syrian rebel groups were through pipelines that were kind of like joint Saudi and Qatari, that were joint Qatari and Saudi pipelines. So with those two countries not having relations anymore, it shut down those pipelines and has starved some of the support to the Syrian rebels. In fact, some people predict that it could be something that will allow Assad to win the Syrian civil war, just because the rebels will lose so much support. Twitter suspended the Twitter account of Al Jazeera Arabic for about 12 hours. I believe this happened either on Friday or Saturday. I don't think Twitter has yet given a reason for the suspension of the account. In other Persian Gulf news, we have a Saudi border guard boat firing on two Iranian fishermen boats and then killing one fisherman on those boats. We have a GAO report being released saying that the military lacks a high level of readiness. I don't know what this is. I'm not sure if this is either a fear tactics or an actual saying that, like, hey, our military is way too bureaucratic, and we've been fighting so many wars in the Middle East for so long, we just simply don't have everything we need right now to be ready to respond to an actual threat to the United States like Russia or China. Alright, some of the biggest news we have gotten is the Afghan troop numbers looking not so great. We had a report come out last week saying that the U.S. was going to add 4,000 more troops to Afghanistan in order to try to break the stalemate. This number comes way in under any reports that I've seen of what the U.S. needs to be able to break the stalemate in Afghanistan. Maybe adding these troops will actually keep the U.S.-backed Afghani government from continuing to lose ground to the Taliban, but it doesn't seem to be that this would be enough troops to really make a difference and turn the tides of the war. And in fact, this was echoed by General Jack Keane, who was the former vice, I believe, commander of the military, way up there in rank under Obama, and certainly has a lot of friends, especially in McMaster and Mattis. He says that the U.S. troop surge needs to be 10 to 20,000 troops, and so it's interesting, we haven't gotten an official announcement of the troop level yet. The 4,000, I think, was kind of like a trial balloon to see how the American people would respond. Of course, it seemed like, to me, a pretty safe bet. They said originally that they recommended between 3,000 and 5,000 troops, and so this is right in the middle of that. And so maybe Jack Keane is floating it to see how the media and the U.S. people respond to that idea. Obviously, from my perspective, the less troops in Afghanistan, the better. One of the things that the military is really dealing with right now is the insider attacks. In fact, we had another event where 7 U.S. soldiers were wounded by a Taliban member disguising himself as a member of the Afghan army and then attacking U.S. soldiers there. This is a huge problem. I believe Gareth Porter said that about half of the U.S. soldiers who have been killed in Afghanistan this year have been killed in insider attack. This is essentially when a member of the Afghani Taliban will join the Afghani army in secret, and then whenever he's either around U.S. troops or anybody else he wants to target, he'll then open fire on those people and kill a bunch of U.S. troops in that way, and it's very disturbing. And the more troops we put in Afghanistan, the more of these problems we're going to have, because they'll just expose the U.S. troops more to these insiders. Of course, the big thing we have here is that, you know, the Afghan war has been going on for 16-ish years now. We're in 2017. I guess we'll be coming up on 16 years towards the end of this year, probably October or November is when that all got started. The Battle of Tora Bora maybe being the first in December of 2001. And so if we look at who's fighting the war now, in the United States, the enlistment age is 18, but I think you could commit to enlist as you're 17 if you're like high school senior on the track to graduate. Of course, you could become a member of ROTC long before that. I believe even into middle school or your freshman year of high school, you could join ROTC. And so if you look and you see that these kids join 18, 19 years old, ROTC 14, 15 years old, the war is older than some of them, and certainly none of these people have any memory of the 9/11 events happening. I was pretty young when 9/11 happened, but I do have memories of it. My younger brother has memories of it, who's a few years younger than me, but anybody younger than him really isn't going to have memory of it, and he's 23. So when you look at it and you realize that, you know, a bunch of 18 through 22 year olds are fighting this war and they have no real recollection of why the war started, it creates I guess a curiosity as to what kind of narrative that's setting for the American culture. At least for somebody my age, I have you know, that emotional attachment to 9/11. I remember, you know, watching the towers fall and the emotional reaction afterwards, how many people felt scared and threatened because, you know, 2 planes came out of the clear blue sky and killed 3,000 American people. From the American point of view, seemingly for no reason. There was nothing that could have explained or precipitated this. So for us to go to war, at least there was that understanding of, like, this is what we're going to war for. Whether that narrative is true or not, that's the narrative they believe. For these young kids going into war now, it seems like a cultural thing, right? This is a whole new generation going to war in the old generation's war. And so they're not going to war with the Afghanis because of 9/11. They're going to war with the Afghanis because America's at war with Afghanistan. That's just the way it is. And I'm sure this is even worse in Afghanistan. Of course, there's just a lot less wealth in Afghanistan. I'm sure that the education system there isn't as good as the education system in America, even if, America's isn't all that great to begin with. And so these, children who are, like I said, now this is a 16-year-old war in Afghanistan. I'm sure the fighting age isn't 18. It's a little bit lower than that. In fact, I'm sure that, like, if you want to join up with the Taliban or some of these rebel groups, you could be way young, probably like 16, 15 years old and take up arms. And that, that's just kind of the way life is. You don't necessarily have that same lifespan in Afghanistan. Also, just because taking up arms may be the only way to defend yourself or provide for yourself. There's been so much warfare in the country, the economy's been destroyed, and one of the only industries left is really the military industry. So maybe when you're 16 years old, you join the Afghani army or the Taliban because that paycheck is going to be what provides for your family. And also you grew up in a culture where you were at war with America, and that's just the way it's always been. And so I guess there's probably a kind of implicit assumption that may be the way it's always going to be, is that you're constantly going to be fighting the American enemy. It changes this war from just a regular war to almost a mythical war. It takes it and it becomes a part of the culture. Like, the Afghanis and the Americans are at war with each other. That's now the way it is. And it's such a shame, and it makes it seem less and less likely to me that this war is ever going to end. Also, it creates a problem with future blowback. Whenever the situation in Afghanistan was the U.S. going in, toppling the Taliban and going after the Afghani guys, I think if the U.S. would go home after that, at least you didn't create a generational enemy in the Afghani people. You didn't, spend 16 years at war with the population. So now, some of the children hate you just because that's the way the world is for them, is that they're at war with the Americans. So I think it prolongs the window of opportunity that America could face blowback even if we bring all of our troops home tomorrow. The other huge news story coming out of the weekend is, of course, the United States shooting down a Syrian jet in the Raqqa province. So let's start, I guess, kind of from the late last week and move up till now. Late last week, the Assad government is advancing up the highway towards Tabik, and then finally enters the Raqqa province on, I believe, Friday or Saturday morning. Those troops are then in the Raqqa province when the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, usually Kurdish forces, YPG, are the backbone of the SDF. They go into the city of Jadin is how I'm going to pronounce it, JA/DIN, if you want to look it up. ISIS held that city, then the SDF went in and kicked out ISIS. In the fighting, the SDF attained a lot of injuries, so they had to pull out of the city after they kicked ISIS out. I don't know how the Syrian government knew about this, but I guess they saw an opportunity to then go ahead and take the city of Jadin for themselves, because not only was ISIS kicked out, but the SDF forces were gone, so they were rushing towards the city. Here's where the story has some disputes. Either there was a Syrian jet that was either bombing ISIS fighters trying to move back into the city, or SDF fighters trying to get back into the city. Depending on what source you read, you get a different answer. Honestly, I have no clue what the answer is at this point. While this Syrian jet was bombing these whatever forces they were, a U.S. F-18 came in and blew up the Syrian plane. It's reported that the pilot of the plane ejected, but I don't know that to be fact. I just saw one source that said that. And so now you have a situation where a U.S. plane just shot down a Syrian plane, and we have a whole bunch of problems. Russia has responded to this by saying that any U.S. coalition forces that fly west of the Euphrates will be considered a target by the Russians, and they will pinpoint their anti-aircraft weaponry at the U.S. coalition planes. I have to imagine some of the countries who have been pretty tentative about being involved in the airstrikes, like Australia, Denmark, and Canada, this will probably cause them to pull back a little bit of their support. Obviously, they don't want any of their planes being shot out of the sky over Syria. It'll be very crazy to see what's going to happen here. Of course, some of the areas in the South Syrian desert where the U.S. has been operating and attacking Syrian-backed forces there, it is west of the Euphrates, so the United States continues to fly missions out of Jordan into Syria. This would cause a problem, but I think most of the planes that go into Syria come from Qatar, not from Jordan. So the Syrian government, of course, condemns this. So I just want to go over some of the questions left that we should kind of keep our eyes on the coming days out of the story. And that is, are U.S. planes going to fly west of the Euphrates? Is the United States going to risk some of their pilots to see how serious the Russians are about this threat? And are the Russians serious about this threat? I mean, it would be a big deal if the Russians shot down a U.S. plane over Syria. Of course, the ongoing question has been, and what I've been continuing to ask, is how far would the Assad government and the Russian government allow the U.S. to push the envelope within Syria? While it's deeply concerning to me that they push the envelope this far, maybe once Russia or Syria starts to push back, Trump will back off. It does seem like kind of a Trumpian tactic to see how far you could push your enemy. The other big question is just who the Syrian jet was bombing at the time it was shot down, while the U.S. claims it was hitting the SDF forces. I've seen other sources that say ISIS. If they were bombing ISIS, I think this is a bigger problem for the U.S. Also, maybe Congress gets involved now. I could see a Rand Paul or Justin Amash teaming up with somebody like a Ron Wyden or Chris Murphy, or even maybe some House Dems like Maxine Waters, and try to rein in Trump on this war in Syria. There is absolutely no authorization at all whatsoever. Couldn't find it if you tried for the U.S. to wage any war in Syria, and certainly not against the Syrian government. The U.S. distorts the 2001 authorization and use of military force and be able to wage a war against ISIS. However, that authorization use of military force can apply to Assad, because Assad had nothing to do with 9/11. And ISIS does pledge allegiance to Osama bin Laden, who was, one of the masterminds of 9/11 and, the main guy behind it. Also in Syria yesterday, we had Iran launching medium-range missiles from Iran, so I guess over Iraq, into Syria and hitting targets around Deir ez-Zor. ISIS has announced that these attacks were in response to ISIS attacking Tehran and carrying out terrorist attacks there. I've been trying to figure out if the jet being shot down or if the missile attacks happen first. I could see either one being a retaliation to the other. Of course, for Iran shooting off these missiles, not only does it take care of some ISIS targets around Deir ez-Zor, which is a place where ISIS has actually been doing well, pretty much all over Syria and Iraq. ISIS has been losing, but they have been making some gains against the Syrian government forces in Deir ez-Zor. And so this was a helpful strategic move, but it also was a show of force. There are a lot of U.S. troops well within the range of these missiles, not only in Syria and Iraq and Qatar, but also in Afghanistan. And so, if the U.S. maybe continues to carry out attacks against the Syrian army, does Iran retaliate against the United States at some point? That's, I guess, one of the outstanding questions of what's, going on between the two countries in Syria. One thing that has been getting worse and worse in Syria is Trump has been carrying out 20% more airstrikes in Iraq and Syria than did Obama in his final 4 months. This has resulted in a lot more civilian casualties. One of the other reasons we're having a lot more civilian casualties is that now we have a lot of civilians packed into very small areas in big population centers like Mosul, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa. In Raqqa, we've had 300 people killed since March, civilians killed, and then in Mosul, there's 150,000 civilians still locked into the last 2 districts held by ISIS. Some news on U.S.-North Korean relations. The U.S. and North Korea are having high-level talks about releasing American prisoners that are currently held in North Korea, and about North Korea's nuclear weapon program. I'm not sure what the U.S. is offering up, but it's good that talks are going on. And of course, we had the Dennis Rodman visit last week where Rodman gave Kim Jong-un a copy of The Art of the Deal. I think Dennis Rodman's visit to North Korea has been one of the bright spots between U.S. and North Korean relations in 2017, and I was super happy to see that happen. Anytime the sides could humanize each other, that's a good thing, and Rodman going and buddying around with the North Koreans and the North Korean Olympic athletes certainly shows the North Koreans that there are nice and friendly Americans in the world, and it hopefully explains the same thing to the Americans about the North Koreans. A few stories coming out of the UK. One person was killed in a suspected terror attack. A 48-year-old white man drove a van into a crowd of people in front of a mosque. Right now, it's only being investigated as a terror attack. I haven't seen any labels applied to it as a terror attack. I guess, there's always a possibility. Maybe he fell asleep at the wheel or something like that, but it's certainly suspected that this is maybe retaliation for some of the similar terrorist attacks that have been going on in the UK. We have 1,000 people across Europe being arrested on suspected terrorism so far in 2017. This isn't to say that there have been 1,000 terrorists caught in Europe in 2017, just that many have been arrested. And then Brexit talks happened today between Britain and the rest of Europe, hoping to settle to a nice deal there. In Israel, 3 Palestinians attacked Israeli border guards with knives. One police woman was killed and a few others were injured, and all 3 Palestinian attackers were killed. The significance of the story is that ISIS initially claimed responsibility for this, then Hamas claimed responsibility for this, and then the Israeli army said no, it wasn't either. It was just some lone wolf-like kind of isolated cell. So it's just interesting to note, typically ISIS isn't able to operate in areas, in Palestinian areas. We have some very important congressional testimony from Rex Tillerson on Iran. One of the things that Tillerson said about Iran was that Iran was funding militias within Iraq. Of course, these militias that Iran is funding in Iraq is the United States Ba'ath Popular Mobilization Forces, and this is just insane that he's condemning Iran for fighting on the side of the United States. This is the level of propaganda that's occurring in the United States. Of course, this should be front page news that that Rex Tillerson is in front of Congress saying that Iran is wrong for funding allies of the United States who are fighting ISIS. How he could get away with this is absolutely unbelievable. Hopefully somebody will eventually bring him to task for such insane things that could possibly have been said. He also said that the United States' policy towards Iran is pushing for a peaceful regime change in the country. Of course, this is how it always starts. It never starts with violent regime change. You can't call for violent regime change right away. You gotta call for peaceful regime change, and then you say, oh my god, the situation in this country has gotten so bad. So, it goes from, we gotta, support the protesters against the Assad government, then oh my god, Assad's killing the protesters, now we gotta overthrow Assad, and hopefully we don't have that happening in Iran, but that's certainly, I'm sure, what the Iranians are thinking, that the United States, this is kind of their first move towards going for a violent regime change in their country, and it just shows Rex Tillerson's absolute ignorance of anything going on in the Middle East. Final story for today. Erdogan's bodyguards have been charged, 12 of them in total, for assaulting some protesters in DC. I'm guessing that none of these bodyguards will ever return to the United States and none of them will ever be punished for it, but it does show that I guess they care a little bit, since other people were charged for it, I guess protesters, and some of those are American or Canadian citizens, so they actually will face punishment for this crime, which is kind of sad that, again, only the victims ever get punished in America. Alright, that will wrap up my show for today. I hope everybody liked the show and is enjoying listening to the show. If you are, please like the show, please subscribe to the show on iTunes, give me a 5-star rating and review there, and then share the show on your favorite social media platform. Also want to let everybody know that I appeared on Ken Williamson's Wizardly Wisdom podcast. We used to do a podcast called the Weekly Freedom File, so I forgot the name of his actual show he does himself, so I went on there, talked about the podcast, talked about some foreign policy stuff, so if anybody's interested in that, why don't you go on over and check that out. I'm on Facebook at Kyle's Files, on Twitter at KYAAALE. The private Facebook group is Foreign Policy Focus, and I think that does it for today. So everybody enjoy yourselves, and I will talk to you next time.